I'm Vivian Ashford, 50 years old, and I spent 30 years rising to Brigadier General in the United States Army, while the one man whose approval I wanted never once looked up to see it. For 3 decades, I gave my father respect, patience, and a daughter who kept trying to earn a nod that never came. And I folded my uniform into a bag before every visit home so he would never have to admit how wrong he had been. But when a young Marine blocked me at the door of a hospital ward full of the soldiers I had carried out of a war, the truth stood up on its own, on whatever legs those men had left. Have you ever been dismissed by someone whose respect should have been a given? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The parking garage near the hospital was almost empty on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in my car for 11 minutes without moving. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the dashboard clock turn over, the way you watch a thing when you're trying to make yourself do something simple and your body quietly refuses. I have stood in rooms where the most powerful people in the country waited for me to speak. I have given orders that put aircraft in the sky and brought them home in the dark. I have signed my name to decisions that I knew would keep me awake for the rest of my life. And that morning, I could not make myself open a car door. I was wearing a plain gray coat. No stars on my shoulders, no ribbons, nothing that told a single passing stranger who I was. That was on purpose. I had spent 30 years being told I was less than I am, and somewhere along the way, I had learned how to wear that judgment like a coat I could take off whenever I chose. That morning, for reasons I did not fully understand yet, I wanted to wear it. I should go back because the morning in that garage only makes sense if you understand the kitchen I grew up in. My father fixed small engines for a living in a town where most people never moved more than a few miles from where they were born. He repaired lawnmowers and chainsaws and the occasional outboard motor in a cinder-block shop with a hand-painted sign, and he was good at it, and he was known for it, and he was content with it. He was a good man in the ways that are easy to overlook. He paid every bill the day it arrived. He never once raised his hand to anyone. He called me kiddo, and he meant it kindly. He also believed, all the way down to the floor of himself, that a life was measured by how close it stayed to home. Anything past the county line was mostly showing off in his view. People who left were people who thought they were better than the place that raised them. He did not say that cruelly. He said it the way other men say the sky is blue, as a fact too obvious to argue with. When I was 10 years old, I sat at our kitchen table and watched him take a lawnmower engine apart and lay every piece out on a towel in the order he had removed them. I told him I wanted to do something big someday, something that mattered. He smiled at me the way you smile at a child who announces she's going to be a dragon when she grows up. He did not say no. He said, "You'll grow out of it, kiddo," and he handed me a bolt to hold. I held the bolt. I always held the bolt. That was the role I had in that house, the helper who passes the tools and learns nothing she is meant to keep. But I remember looking at the engine on that towel, every piece laid out in the exact order it had come apart, and understanding something my father did not realize he was teaching me. Complicated things can be taken down to their parts, and the parts can be understood, and a person who is patient enough and stubborn enough can put anything back together better than it was. I did not have words for it at 10. I have words for it now. He taught me how I think. He just never once imagined where that kind of thinking might carry a daughter of his. There was a science fair the year I was 12. I built a working model of a small turbine, and a teacher I had never spoken to before stopped at my table and asked me 3 questions in a row, the way you talk to someone you have decided to take seriously. It was the first time in my life an adult had looked at something I made and seen the maker. I rode that feeling for a year. My father came to the fair, and he was proud, and he told the neighbors his girl was clever with her hands, which from him was high praise. But even then, even with the ribbon in my hand, he framed it as a charming thing about his daughter, rather than a door that might actually open. The difference between those 2 ways of seeing a child is the difference this whole story is about. My mother kept a drawer in the hall cabinet. I did not know what was in it for years. She was a quiet woman who had learned to pick her battles, and she had decided long before I was born that arguing with my father was not a battle anyone won. So she kept her own counsel, and she kept that drawer closed, and she watched me with eyes that saw a great deal more than she ever said out loud. When I was 18, I stood on our front porch on a warm evening and told my father I had accepted an Army scholarship to pay for college. I had the whole thing rehearsed. I had reasons, I had numbers, I had a plan for what came after. He listened to about half of it, with his arms crossed, and then he put his hand on my shoulder and he said the sentence that shaped the next 3 decades of my life. "It's a phase, kiddo. You'll get it out of your system and you'll come home." I remember the exact temperature of the anger that went through me. I remember the porch light and the moths around it and the smell of cut grass. And I remember deciding right there that I would not argue with him anymore. Arguing was asking him to believe me, and I was finished asking. I would simply become the thing he swore I would never be, and one day the proof would be too large for even him to ignore. That was the bargain I made silently with a man who never knew we were negotiating. I would give him respect and patience and decades of effort. He would give me back the steady, gentle certainty that I had chosen wrong. For 30 years, that was the shape of the two of us, and I carried my half of it without complaint, because complaining would have meant admitting how much it hurt. Back in the present, in that parking garage, my hand finally found the door handle. I told myself that the two people I had never once been able to make truly look at me were my father, and every stranger who had ever decided what I was by a single glance at my clothes. I did not yet know that both of those things were about to be answered in the same week, in 2 very different rooms, by 2 people who could not have been less alike. The reason I was afraid, if I am being fully honest with you, was not the men. It was what the men would show me about myself. I had avoided that ward for a year. I told myself it was scheduling, the relentless calendar of a general officer, but that was a lie I had let myself believe. The truth was that I did not know if I could sit in a room full of the cost of that morning and not come apart. I had carried them out. I had not yet let myself feel what it meant that some of them would never carry themselves the same way again. A part of me believed that if I walked in there, I would have to answer for the arithmetic of who I saved, and in what order, to their faces, in the daylight. So I sat in a parked car in a gray coat, a 50-year-old woman with a silver star in a drawer at home, working up the nerve to be looked at by the people I had bled beside. I opened the door and I walked toward the hospital. The disrespect in my life was almost never loud. That is the part people misunderstand when I tell them this story. They picture someone screaming at me, some dramatic public humiliation. It was quieter than that, and because it was quiet, it lasted much longer. It was 1,000 small assumptions stacked one on top of another over a career. The assumption that I was the assistant and not the officer. That I was somebody's wife, waiting patiently in a lobby for a man to finish his important business. That the clipboard in my hand made me the help. For most of my years in uniform, and out of it, people decided what I was in the first half second of seeing me, and then they spent the rest of the conversation being slowly, visibly, sometimes comically surprised. I learned to let the assumption stand. I learned to let a man explain my own job to me, nodding politely, and then to quietly correct the record later with results he could not argue with. It is a strange and exhausting skill, making yourself small on purpose so that the truth lands harder when it finally arrives. I got very good at it over the years. I am no longer certain that being good at it was a good thing. The first real milestone in my career was my commissioning in the spring of 1998. I was 22 years old. I stood in a long line of brand new second lieutenants in dress uniform and took the oath of office, my right hand up, my voice steady, and the only member of my family in the folding chairs was my mother. My father had sent word 2 days before that he had the shop to mind and could not get away. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself a great many things that did not matter, and they did not become true just because I said them. Afterward, my mother hugged me so hard it surprised me, and she pressed a folded square of newspaper into my hand. It was a clipping from the local paper, just 3 lines, a note that a hometown girl had earned her Army commission. She had cut it out and saved it and brought it all that way to give to me. I did not understand then that she had started a collection that morning and that she would keep adding to it in secret for the next 26 years. A few years into my service, I met Yolanda Pierce. She was a lieutenant like me, sharp and funny, and just as worn down from being mistaken for the coffee girl in every meeting we walked into. We became the kind of friends who can say the worst, truest thing out loud to each other and trust that it will be held carefully. One night, After a senior officer had spent an entire planning meeting addressing only the men in the room and looking through the two of us like glass, Yolanda leaned over and said something I have never forgotten. "They'll keep mistaking us for the help, Viv," she said, "so we will just be the best help they ever underestimated." We built whole careers on that one idea. We let them underestimate us, again and again, and then we made ourselves undeniable. It worked. It also cost something I did not have a word for until much later. In 2003, I deployed to Iraq as a captain. There was a day at a checkpoint when everything went wrong at the same moment, and I learned something about myself that would matter a great deal years later at a forward operating base whose name I had not yet heard. When the shooting started, I did not feel the pull most people feel, the pull to get behind something solid and stay there. I felt the opposite pull. I felt myself drawn toward my wounded. I stayed out in the open with a hurt young soldier far longer than any manual would have approved of, talking to him, keeping his eyes on me, and I would not move until he was moving toward help. It was not bravery, exactly, whatever the citation later said. It was that I could not make my own legs carry me away from a person who needed me. Something in me simply would not allow it. That was how I was built, down at the foundation, and it never changed, not in 26 years. The young soldier's name was a private I had known for all of 3 weeks. He had a wife back home and a baby he had only seen in photographs. I kept telling him about that baby while the medic worked, made him describe her, made him argue with me about whose nose she had, anything to keep his eyes on mine and off the wound. He lived. I got a letter from his wife 2 years later with a photograph of a toddler in it. And I kept that photograph in my wallet through 3 more deployments, because on the days when the job felt like nothing but paperwork and politics, it reminded me what the paperwork was actually for. My father, had he known any of this, would have heard only that his daughter had been somewhere dangerous and should not have been. He could not hold both things at once, the danger and the meaning. Most people who have never served cannot. I stopped expecting him to. I came home from that deployment with ribbons I never once wore inside my parents' house. There was a holiday dinner, years later, when I was a major. My father introduced me to a neighbor who was sitting across the table. "This is my daughter," he said, with real affection. "She's in the army. Does paperwork mostly." I had a chest of decorations in a drawer at my own home, hundreds of miles away. I had led soldiers under fire and brought most of them back. And I sat there at that table and let my father call me the paperwork daughter, because it was genuinely easier than watching his face if he were ever forced to understand how wrong he had been. I folded my dress uniform into a garment bag before every single flight home, and I became smaller again and again on purpose, in the one place I should have been able to be my whole size. There was a second deployment to Afghanistan in 2010 and into 2011, when I was a major running operations out of a valley outpost that took fire often enough that we stopped flinching at it. I will not tell you all of it. I will only say that I learned in those mountains that the thing I felt at the checkpoint in Iraq was not a fluke or a single bad afternoon. When the worst happened, I went toward my people. Every time. It was not a choice I made with the thinking part of my brain. It was older than that and lower down. There was a night in that valley when a patrol got caught on the wrong side of a ridge, and we worked the radio for 6 hours straight, 0200 hours to 0800 hours, walking them home in the dark, one terrain feature at a time. I did not sit down once. When the sun finally came up and the last of them came through the wire, a sergeant first class who had been in the army longer than I had looked at me across the operations center and said, "You would have come out there yourself, wouldn't you, ma'am, on foot if we'd lost comms?" And I told him the truth, which was yes. The men and women I served with came to know that about me in a way that needed no citation and no ceremony. My own father never would. There is a particular grief in being thoroughly known by strangers and a mystery to the man who named you. I want to tell you now about the Tuesday I finally walked onto that ward. The hallway was long and bright, and it smelled the way every hospital smells, like cleanliness laid over something it is trying to cover. My heart was loud in my own ears. I was reading the room numbers as I passed them, getting closer to the ward where they had told me the men were. The ones still in long-term rehabilitation, a full year after the worst day any of us had ever lived through. I had come without an escort. I had come without my uniform. I could have done this the other way. I could have called ahead and arrived as a general with a staff officer clearing the corridor in front of me and every person on the floor standing straight as I passed. I did not want that. I did not want it to be a general's visit, a thing penciled onto a schedule, a photograph for someone's file. I wanted it to be mine. I wanted to sit with those men as the person who had been down in the dirt beside them, not as a silver star riding on a shoulder. So that morning I looked, on purpose, exactly like a nobody. A middle-aged woman in a plain gray coat, no badge, no lanyard, no rank, walking onto a restricted ward like she might have taken a wrong turn looking for the gift shop. There was a young Marine standing watch near the entrance to the ward. He was in his camouflage uniform, crisp and correct, maybe 22 years old, with the kind of squared-away posture that tells you a young man takes himself extremely seriously and has not yet been humbled by very much of life. He was part of a small detail attending a senior officer who was recovering on that ward. His job, as he understood it that morning, was very simple. Keep the wrong people out. He saw the gray coat. He saw a woman with no visible reason to be standing where she was standing. And he made a decision about me in half a second, the very same way people had been making decisions about me my entire life. He stepped directly into my path and put up a flat hand. "Ma'am, this is a restricted ward," he said. "Visitors wait outside." I stopped. I kept my voice level and quiet. "Corporal," I said, "if you will let me explain." He cut me off before I could finish. "Outside. Now please, ma'am. I want to be fair to him even now. He was doing a version of his job. He did not know who I was, and he had no way to know. But there is a particular tiredness that settles into your bones when you are told, one more time, by one more person who has not bothered to actually look at you, that you do not belong in the very room where you have earned your place in blood. I felt every one of my 50 years in that hallway. I felt the porch and the empty chair at my commissioning and the paperwork daughter, all of it at once. And then, from the nearest bed, I heard my own name spoken in a voice that I knew. His name was Reggie Vaughn. He was a staff sergeant, 28 years old, and he had lost his left leg below the knee on the day that I carried him to a waiting helicopter. He had been half-conscious then, gray-faced, arguing even as he bled. He was very much awake now, propped up in a hospital bed, and he had heard my voice carry across the ward. He reached out and gripped the cold rail of his bed. He dragged himself upright onto his one leg and the prosthetic he was still learning to trust, swaying, his knuckles gone white where they wrapped the metal. The effort of it stood out on his face, and he said the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. "Attention on deck." Then, louder, his eyes locked on the young Marine, he said it plainly, so there could be no mistaking it. "That's the general who carried us out." I will never forget the corporal's face in that 1 second. He looked confused more than anything, almost lost, his eyes going from Vaughn to me and back to Vaughn again, glancing around the ward as though he expected someone to step forward and explain the joke to him, to tell him what he was supposed to do with a sentence like that. No one explained anything to him. Instead, the ward stood up. I do not know how else to describe what happened next. One by one, every wounded man in that long room began to move. Men pushed themselves up off their beds with both arms. Men reached for crutches leaned against nightstands. A soldier with both forearms, wrapped in casts, got his feet under him and rose anyway, unable to lift a hand, but standing, because standing was what he had. Men who could barely hold their own weight stood, gripping rails and bed frames, and in one case each other, and they came to attention, and those who had a hand to spare raised it in salute. Some of them were shaking with the effort of staying upright. None of them sat back down. They held it. I knew some of those faces. Not all, but some. There was a young specialist near the window who had taken burns down one arm and who had been, the last time I saw him, unconscious, on a stretcher, with a medic breathing for him. He was on his feet now, saluting with the arm that still worked. There was a sergeant I remembered only as a voice on a radio, that terrible morning, a voice that had kept calling out grid coordinates long after he should have gone into shock, and now there was a face attached to the voice. And the face was looking at me like I was something it had prayed to. I had to lock my own knees to keep steady. I have been decorated by people whose names you would know. None of it ever touched me the way that silent, swaying, broken room full of salutes touched me. They had nothing left to give, and they were giving it to me anyway. The young Marine turned in a slow, dazed circle in the middle of all of it. and I watched the truth arrive in him the way water arrives under a door, slowly and then all at once. He understood that he had stepped in front of someone these broken men would tear their own stitches to honor. The senior officer the detail had been attending was a Marine colonel named Wade Dorsey, 46 years old, who had been badly wounded the same day as the rest of them and was a long way from healed. He levered himself up to his full height, one hand braced on his bed, and he spoke to the corporal quietly, without a trace of cruelty, which somehow made it land harder than shouting ever could. "Corporal," he said, "you are holding the door on Brigadier General Ashford. She is the reason half this ward came home." The blood drained out of the young man's face all at once. He snapped to attention so hard and so fast that it looked like it physically hurt him. And he brought his hand up into a salute, eyes locked forward at nothing, mortified all the way down to the soles of his boots. I could have let him stand there. I could have let that moment do its work on him with a sharp edge, the way a lesser version of myself, a younger and angrier version, might have wanted. I did not. I returned the room's salute first, the salute of the men who had stood up for me on the legs they had left because they had earned the first answer. And then I turned to all of them and I said, gently, as you were, "Sit down before you fall down. That is an order, gentlemen." They sat, slowly, and the young Marine stayed at rigid attention there in the doorway. And I looked at him for a long moment, and I saw, just for that moment, every single person who had ever glanced at my coat and believed they already knew the whole of me. Colonel Dorsey lowered himself back onto the edge of his bed, slow and careful with whatever was still healing in him, and he caught my eye across the ward and gave me the smallest nod. One officer to another, the kind of nod that says I have got the rest of this room, go do what you came to do. I have thought about that nod a great deal since. He was a colonel and I outranked him, and none of that was what passed between us. What passed between us was the understanding of two people who had both been out in the open on bad mornings and had both decided the same way about it. Rank had nothing to do with it. Some recognitions run deeper than rank, and that one did. The ward settled slowly after that, the way a room settles after something large has moved through it. Men eased themselves back onto their beds. The ordinary sounds of a hospital crept back in, the soft electronic tones of the machines, the squeak of a cartwheel out in the hall, someone coughing, and I did exactly what I had driven all that way to do. I sat down on the edge of Reggie Vaughn's bed, and I stayed for the whole afternoon. We talked like soldiers, not like a general and a sergeant. He told me what he remembered of that day, which turned out to be very little, and I filled in the parts the morphine and the shock had taken away from him. I told him how it had actually gone, the true order of events, who had been where and when. The forward operating base had been hit at dawn with what we call a complex attack, the kind that comes from several directions at once and is designed first and foremost to create confusion. I had been visiting that base. I was not supposed to be anywhere near a fight that day. A piece of shrapnel had opened my side and another had caught me across the back, and somewhere in the noise and the dust I had decided, in the way you decide things without ever really stopping to decide them, that I was not leaving until my people were on the birds. So I worked the casualty collection point. I had the medics and the walking wounded carry the worst cases first. When they got to Vaughn, his leg was already gone below the knee, and he was lying there actually arguing that somebody else should go ahead of him, that he could wait. I told him he was not allowed to quit on me, and we lifted him onto the helicopter over his objections. I told him the parts he had lost, how the first blast had walked across the motor pool and put 4 men down before any of us understood what direction it had come from, how the second wave had come from the tree line to the east and we had been pinned for the better part of 20 minutes with the wounded out in the open between us and the aid station, how I had crawled out to the nearest of them with a corpsman because waiting was not survivable, and how once I was out there, I simply did not come back in until the work was done. I told him that he had been the 7th man we moved, and that he had spent the entire time trying to give up his place in line, and that I had used language with him that I would not repeat to his mother. "I remember your voice telling me I wasn't allowed to quit," he said now, staring up at the ceiling tiles. So I didn't. I kept that. The whole year in here, every time the rehab got bad, every time I wanted to stop, I kept that. You want to know the truth, ma'am? Half the reason I can walk is that I wasn't going to be the one soldier you carried out who quit later. I did not have anything to say to that for a while. There are moments when the only honest response is to sit quietly with a person and let the weight of what they have said be in the room. So that is what I did. While we were talking, the young corporal came back. He had been relieved at his post for a few minutes, and he approached the foot of the bed stiffly, his whole body braced for the apology he had clearly been writing in his head out in the hallway. I could see it coming, the careful and correct words, the shame underneath them. I waved it off before he could begin. I did not need his apology, and I did not want to watch him crawl. So I asked him a real question instead. "How long have you been in, Corporal?" I said. "Where are you from?" He blinked, knocked completely off his rehearsed script, and after a second he answered me. 2 years in. A small town in the middle of the country, he said, and named it. And it was not so very different from the town that raised me. I filed him away in my mind, the way you do with a young person who has just made the worst mistake of his short career and is standing in front of you waiting to be destroyed for it. I did not want to destroy him. I wanted to teach him. There is a difference, and most people in my position forget it. That evening I went back down to the parking garage and sat in my car again, and this time I called Yolanda Pierce. She is a full colonel now. She is still the person to whom I say the worst and truest thing out loud. I told her a whole ward of wounded men had stood up for me that afternoon, and then I made myself tell her the harder thing, the thing that had been sitting under the pride all day, like a stone under a blanket. A whole ward of wounded men stood up for me today, I said, and the very first thing I felt, underneath all of it, was that my father still wouldn't. She was quiet for a moment on the line. Then she said, "Viv, you have been waiting for that man to salute you your entire life. Those soldiers just showed you what it looks like when people actually see you. Maybe stop waiting on the one who won't." I drove home on a dark highway, thinking the whole way about the difference between being recognized and being known. The corporal had recognized me eventually because a colonel handed him a fact he could not refuse. The men on that ward knew me because we had bled into the same dirt on the same morning. And my father, who had known me longer than anyone alive, had never once allowed himself to truly look. Somewhere on that dark highway, I made a decision. I decided I was finished auditioning for his approval. I had spent 30 years trying to make my own father do the very thing a total stranger had done by accident in a hospital doorway. Look again. Look at what is actually standing in front of you. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make my father the villain of this, and he is not the villain of this. The villain, if there is one, is the small and stubborn idea that a person can be fully known by the surface they present. My father caught that idea young, in a town that rewarded it, and he never set it down. The corporal caught it too, in his own way, and he was lucky enough to be shown the door out of it at 22 instead of at 78. I had spent a career being the casualty of that idea, and somewhere on that highway, I understood that I had also, in my worst moments, been its carrier. Every time I folded my uniform into a garment bag, every time I let a man explain my own job to me, I had agreed with the lie. I had helped people believe I was less than I was. That stopped on that highway. Not the loving of my father, the agreeing with him about me. That stopped. In the days that followed, I made 2 deliberate choices, one about the corporal and one about my father, and I made them both with my eyes open. I went back to the hospital and I asked to speak with the young Marine and with the staff non-commissioned officer who ran his detail. The staff sergeant in charge of him arrived braced and tight-jawed, plainly expecting that a 1-star general had come down in person to end a corporal's career over an insult in a hallway. That is, in fairness, usually exactly how these things go. I did not file a complaint. I did not ask for anyone to be punished. Instead, I told the corporal about the day at the forward operating base. I told him about the men on that ward and what each of them had given and would never get back. And then I told him the one thing I most wanted him to carry out of that room for the rest of his life. "You looked at a coat and you thought you knew the woman wearing it," I said. "I have had generals do the very same thing to me, and senators, and men with far less excuse than you have at 22. Do not carry the shame of this around with you. Shame is useless weight. Just promise me you will never do it to another human being again." The staff sergeant, who had walked into that room ready to fall on his sword to defend his young Marine, realized somewhere in the middle of it that I was the one protecting his Marine. His shoulders came down half an inch. The corporal's eyes went wet, and he held them open and would not let it fall. And he said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that I believed. "I want to tell you why I did that. Because I have been asked, and the honest answer matters to me. I have spent my whole life on the receiving end of people deciding who I was before they bothered to find out. My father did it out of love and fear. Strangers did it out of laziness. The cost was the same either way. And I had learned, somewhere in those 30 years, that the only thing that ever changed a person who got it wrong was being shown a better way, rather than being broken for the mistake." Breaking that corporal would have taught him only to be afraid of generals. Teaching him taught him to look harder at every human being for the rest of his life. I knew which of those two soldiers I would rather have standing at a door someday. So I made the one I wanted. Then I drove to my parents' town, not on a holiday this time, not performing for anyone. I went to close the distance on my own terms for once in my life, while there was still time to close it at all. My father was in the kitchen when I arrived. Of course he was, sitting at the same table where he had once handed me a bolt to hold. I sat down across from him and I told him, calmly and without heat, what had happened on the ward. And then I told him what I actually do for a living, the command I hold, the number of human beings I am responsible for every single day. And the day I was wounded, a year before, which I had never told him about because he had not asked, and I had finally stopped offering pieces of myself to a man who set them down without looking. He reached for the old script the way a man reaches for a railing in the dark. "You never told us any of this," he said, and there was something almost accusing in it, as if the silence had been mine alone. "You never asked, Dad?" I said. And there was no anger in my voice, which honestly surprised me more than it surprised him. For 30 years, you never once asked. The kitchen went quiet in a way that kitchen had never been quiet in my entire life. And then my mother stood up from her chair without a word, walked to the hall cabinet, and opened the drawer. She came back carrying a thick stack of newspaper clippings held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle and cracked with age. Every promotion, every citation that had ever made the local paper. A photograph of me as a young lieutenant, impossibly young, squinting into the sun. She had been quietly cutting them out and saving them since 1998, the entire time, all those years, in silence, in a drawer my father had never once thought to open. He took the stack into his two hands, his mechanic's hands, scarred and careful. He looked down at 26 years of his own daughter's life, a life he had refused to read while it was happening right in front of him. He turned the clippings over slowly, one at a time, and I watched him read his daughter the way he reads a repair manual, carefully, taking it in. He stopped on the photograph of me as a lieutenant for a long time. He touched the edge of it with one finger. My mother spoke then, and she said more in that kitchen than I had heard her say in years. "I kept them because somebody in this house had to. Gordon," she said, "somebody in this house had to know what she was doing out there. I was not going to let her whole life happen and have nothing in this house say it was real." He did not say anything. He did not have to say anything. I watched the crack start in him, the first hairline fracture running through 30 years of certainty, and I did not feel triumph. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, and in every version I had felt vindicated. The real thing felt nothing like that. I felt something quieter and sadder and a great deal more like grief. Grief for all the years the three of us had lost to a story my father told himself about what his daughter was allowed to be. The lesson I had given the corporal did not stay where I left it. I learned that over the following weeks, and it surprised me. He changed. I heard about it before I ever saw it for myself. On a later visit to the ward, the physician who ran the place stopped me in the hallway. Her name was Lena Hartwell, a Navy commander, the kind of doctor who notices everything that happens in her wards, because she has learned that the noticing is half of the medicine she has to give. "Whatever you said to that young Marine," she told me, lowering her voice. "He's a different kid now. He sits with the ones who don't get any visitors, on his own time, off the clock. Nobody told him to." I went and found him, and it was true. The boy who had once guarded a doorway was now learning the names of the men inside it. He sat with the soldiers whose families lived too far away to visit, the ones who watched other men get folded into their wives and mothers and went home to nobody. And he listened to their stories, and somewhere in the listening, he had stopped seeing a ward full of strangers to be kept in line and started seeing people. Whole people. The exact thing I had asked of him. I changed something too in those weeks. On my next visit, I came in my uniform, the full thing, the star on my shoulder plain for anyone to see. Not for the men who already knew down to their bones exactly who I was. I did it for myself. I was finished arriving as a nobody in a gray coat in order to spare other people the small trouble of having to see me. It is a strange thing to confess that a brigadier general had to teach herself to walk into a room as a brigadier general. But the habit of shrinking was 30 years deep in me, and habits that deep do not lift off in a single afternoon, not even after a room full of wounded men stands up for you. I had spent so long making myself easy to overlook that being seen felt, at first, almost like a kind of exposure. I had to practice it the way Vaughn was practicing walking, one deliberate step at a time, until it stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like the truth. The gray coat went to the back of the closet. I have not worn it since. Some clothes you only need until you understand why you were hiding inside them. Back in my parents' town, my father was struggling, privately, with the sheer size of what he had spent his whole life refusing to look at. My mother told me about it in pieces over the phone. He had gone quiet at the shop, she said, quieter than his usual quiet. He had asked a neighbor who had served in the Navy, casually, like it was nothing at all, what exactly a brigadier general was, where it sat, what it meant. He had driven past the recruiting office where I had first signed my name at 18, and he had pulled into the empty lot, and he had simply sat there for a while, the way I had sat in a hospital garage, working myself up to something I was afraid of. And then, one evening, he called me. My father, a man who communicated almost entirely in tasks and weather reports and the price of parts, who had never in my memory initiated a conversation about anything that lived under the skin, called me on the telephone. He could not say he was sorry, the word was too big, and the distance was too far, and he had no practice. So instead, he asked me a question about my work. A real one, a careful one, a question that took some thought to form. It was the first real question my father had asked me in my entire adult life. He asked me how a person decides who goes on the helicopter first, when there are more wounded than there is room. It was a hard question and an honest one, and it had clearly cost him something to form it. So I answered it honestly. I told him about triage, about the awful arithmetic of saving the most lives with the least time, about how the math has to be done by someone, and how that someone has to be able to live with it afterward. He was quiet on the line for a moment, and then he said, "That sounds like it would be a heavy thing to carry." And I said, "It is, Dad. It is the heaviest thing I carry." And he said, "I didn't know. I just didn't know." There was a whole apology folded up inside those 4 words, even if he could not unfold it. It was not an apology, not in the way the word usually means. I knew that even as it was happening. But it was the beginning of something far better than an apology. It was the beginning of Tell Me. The relationship with my father rebuilt itself slowly after that and on entirely new terms, and I did not once pretend that the 30 years had not happened. You do not get to skip the bill. He understood that, I think, better than I expected him to. A few weeks later, the hospital held a small ceremony to honor the soldiers in long-term rehabilitation. A quiet thing, families and staff and a few folding chairs. I invited my parents. I genuinely did not expect my father to come. He had a 30-year record of not coming, and records are hard to break. He came. He stood at the back of the room in his good shirt, the one he wears to funerals and to weddings, looking entirely out of place among the uniforms, and trying anyway, which is its own kind of courage in a man like him. It was the first event of my entire career that my father had ever once attended. 26 years of service, and that small ceremony in a hospital was the first. Reggie Vaughn was further along in his recovery by then, moving with real confidence on the prosthetic, and he rolled his wheelchair over to where my parents were standing near the wall, and he introduced himself, not knowing the first thing about the history between my father and me. And then he told my father, plainly, the truth that my father would never have been able to believe coming from my own mouth. "Sir," he said, "your daughter stood out in the open with shrapnel in her and would not leave, would not let anyone move her until every last one of us was on those birds. I am standing here talking to you because of her. A lot of us are." My father heard, from a wounded stranger in a hospital, the thing he had refused to hear from his own child for 3 decades. I watched it land in him. I watched his jaw work and his eyes go bright, and I had to look away to give him the privacy of it. My father did a thing then that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He took Vaughn's hand in both of his, the careful mechanic's hands, and he held it, and he said, "Thank you for telling me that, son. Nobody ever told me what she does." He said it to a 28-year-old man in a wheelchair, but he was saying it to me and to himself, and to the 30 years. Vaughn, who had no idea he had just been handed the closing argument in a case that had run my whole life, simply smiled and said, "Somebody should have, sir. She is the best officer I ever served under." The corporal was there at the ceremony, too. When he caught sight of me across the room, he came to attention and rendered a salute, and this time he knew precisely who he was saluting, and there was nothing braced or frightened anywhere in it. It was clean and it was glad. I returned it with a small nod that told him, as clearly as any words could have, that the slate between us was wiped clean. We were good, he and I, better than good. Afterward, my father and I sat together on a bench just outside the hospital doors. He turned his cap over in his hands several times, the way he handles a part he is trying to understand. And then he managed the closest thing to an apology that he had anywhere inside him. "I thought keeping you close was love," he said, not looking at me, looking at the cap. "I think maybe I just kept you small." "You can start being my father now, Dad," I told him. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded slowly, still looking at the cap in his hands. He said he did not know how to do the part that came next, the catching up, the asking. I told him he did not have to know how. I told him he just had to keep doing what he had done in that kitchen, which was to read the clippings instead of looking away from them. He said in his plain way that he supposed a man could learn a new repair at 78 if the machine mattered enough to him. It was the closest he had ever come to telling me I mattered to him in those exact terms, and we both knew it, and we both let it sit there on the bench between us without poking at it. It was not everything. It did not erase the empty folding chair at my commissioning, or the paperwork daughter, or the 30 silent years. Some things do not erase. But it was honest, and it was a beginning, and a beginning was so much more than the two of us had ever managed to have before. Time moved the way time does, without asking permission. Through the late summer, I kept driving out to visit the ward, and slowly, one at a time, some of the beds began to go empty. It was the good kind of empty, the kind everyone there is working toward. Men going home or stepping down to outpatient care. Vaughn was walking better and steadier every single time I saw him, until the prosthetic stopped looking like a thing attached to him and started looking like part of how he moved. I got a message from the corporal that summer. He had been reassigned to a new unit. He wrote to thank me, formally and a little awkwardly, and then he told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He told me that he now leads junior Marines of his own, and that he repeats my line about the coat to every one of them when they come in. You cannot read a person's worth off their clothes. You cannot know what someone has carried by looking at the outside of them. The lesson had grown its own legs and walked clear out of that hospital and into young people I will never meet and never know. That is the only kind of immortality I have ever believed in. Yolanda and I had one of our long talks that fall, the kind that run well past midnight and circle back on themselves. We added it all up together, a shared career of being underestimated, what it had quietly cost us and what, in spite of everything, it had built. And somewhere in there, I finally said the thing I had spent 50 years figuring out. For 30 years, I made myself smaller so that other people would be comfortable around me, I told her. I am 50 years old. I am done shrinking. I am out of the shrinking business for good. She lifted her glass to that, and she did not say anything for a moment, because some things between old friends do not need to be answered out loud. Then she said the thing only she could have said. You know what gets me, Viv? It took a kid who got it wrong to fix something 30 years of you getting it right never could. You did everything correctly your whole career. You earned every single thing the hard and honest way. And the lock that finally turned was a Marine corporal making a mistake at a door. She laughed, and I laughed, and underneath the laughing was the truth that the universe almost never gives us our breakthroughs in the shape we expect. Mine came wearing the wrong uniform and the wrong assumptions, and it set me free anyway. At my parents' house, around that same time, I noticed something I was not supposed to notice. My father had taken one of my mother's clippings, an old one, yellowed and soft at the folds, and he had bought a frame for it, and he had hung it on the wall of his shop where every customer who walked in would see it. He never mentioned it to me. Not once. I never mentioned it to him. I let him keep that, the small private dignity of doing the right thing without having to stand up and explain himself, because that is exactly the kind of mercy I had wanted my whole life and so rarely been given. On a bright, cold morning in the autumn, I walked back onto that same ward in my uniform. The young Marine standing watch at the door, a different one this time, snapped to attention the very instant he saw the star on my shoulder. And I smiled at him because the recognition no longer meant what it once would have meant to me. I did not need it from him. I did not need it from anyone. I simply accepted it, and I walked through the door into a room that had once stood up for me on the legs it had left. I sat with Reggie Vaughn one last time before his discharge to outpatient care. He thanked me again, and I shook my head, and I told him the truth I had been carrying ever since that first afternoon in the doorway. "You saved me as much as I ever saved you," I said. "When you stood up in that doorway and called the room to attention, you handed me back something it took my own father 30 years to return. So we are even, Sergeant. We were always even." He shook his head at that the way a young man does when he thinks his superior is being too modest, and he said, "With respect, ma'am, that math does not work. You carried me out of a war. I just stood up in a hospital." And I told him he was wrong, that he did not understand yet what it costs a person to keep being made invisible, and what it gives them back when somebody finally refuses to let it happen. I told him that the standing up was not the small thing he thought it was. He looked at me for a moment, like he was filing that away to understand later, the way you do with something an older person tells you that you are not quite ready to hear. I hope he understands it someday. I hope it takes him a lot less than 50 years. The next Sunday I was out at my parents' house. A neighbor stopped in to drop something off, and my father, the very same man who had once introduced me across a dinner table as the paperwork daughter, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Tell him what my daughter does." So I told the neighbor what I do. And my father stood there beside me and listened to the whole of it, like it was the most interesting thing he had ever heard in his life, nodding, asking the man to wait so I could explain a part again. Across the room, my mother caught my eye over the top of her coffee cup, and the two of us pretended very hard not to cry, and I will tell you honestly that neither one of us managed it very well at all. I want to say one last thing to you, whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this from. If you have spent your life waiting for one particular person to finally see you, to finally look up and recognize what has been standing in front of them the whole time, I want to tell you what a roomful of wounded soldiers taught me in a hospital doorway. The people who truly recognize you will stand up on their own. You will not have to beg them or argue with them or prove yourself one more time. You will not have to make yourself smaller to fit through their door. You do not have to shrink to be loved. And you do not have to keep waiting at anyone's door to be let into your own life. I spent 30 years believing that if I just achieved enough, served enough, sacrificed enough, the one person whose approval I wanted would finally hand it over, and then I would feel whole. I had the order of it exactly backward. The wholeness does not come from their approval. The wholeness comes first, when you decide to stop trading yourself away in small pieces to buy it. The approval, if it ever comes, arrives afterward, as a gift, and by then you find you're already standing on your own 2 feet and do not strictly need it. That is not a sad thing. It is the most freeing thing I know. The day I stopped needing my father to salute me was the day I could finally enjoy it, when, in his own clumsy and beautiful way, he finally did. I stood in my parents' kitchen that Sunday afternoon, a general in my own right, finally and fully seen by the only people whose seeing I had ever truly wanted, and I made a discovery that I did not expect. I no longer needed it. That is the part nobody ever tells you. The recognition, when it finally comes, is sweet. But the freedom is so much sweeter, and the freedom, it turns out, had been mine to take the entire time. I keep that knowledge close now, the way I once kept a photograph of a private's daughter in my wallet. On the hard days, when the old habit of shrinking tries to creep back into my shoulders, I remember a room full of men who had every reason to stay down and who stood up anyway. I remember a young Marine learning to look twice. I remember an old man framing a clipping and never mentioning it. And I remember that I do not have to wait in any parking garage, in any gray coat, for permission to be the whole size of myself. Neither do you. That is the only thing I came here to tell you. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If you have ever had someone close to you decide who you were before they bothered to look, I would really like to hear about it. Was there ever a person who finally saw you, and did it come from where you expected? Did you ever catch yourself making your own self smaller just to keep the peace at the table? And if you had been that young Marine in the doorway, what would you have done after the whole ward stood up? Tell me in the comments. I read them. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and leave a comment.